Another live stream. I said this morning that we would try to get on and do a part two because there's so much to discuss, and of course, developments are breaking every few minutes. So we talked this morning. So it was 9 a.m. here. So that was, what was that, like 7 hours ago or so. And as of 7 hours ago, Wagner and Prigozhin were on the march to Moscow. And as of now, which is 4 o'clock p.m. here on the East Coast in the United States, as of now, the latest reporting, and this has been corroborated both in the Russian press and in mainstream media in the West, that a deal has been struck. A deal was struck between Wagner, Prigozhin, and the Russian government, and that the deal was brokered by Lukashenko in Belarus, which itself is very, very interesting. The latest I heard just a few minutes before we came on, Putin's spokesperson Peskov has released a statement saying not only was the deal brokered by Lukashenko in Belarus, but that Prigozhin has agreed to go to Belarus. And this would be in exchange for the Russian state dropping, canceling, whatever you want to call it, the criminal charges that they opened against Prigozhin. In addition to that, we're hearing that not only amnesty for the Wagner fighters, but also contracts with the Ministry of Defense for those Wagner fighters that refused to participate in Prigozhin's march on Moscow. So very, very interesting. It's not clear what Prigozhin would go ahead and actually do in Belarus. It's certainly not clear, but rumors are that at the very least, Shoigu and Gerasimov were part of this deal, and that apparently we should expect the resignations of Shoigu and Gerasimov at any time now. So there's a lot to discuss there. Sukant, what do you make of all of it?
Did you hear also what Medvedev said, what his spin was? It was very funny. So
What's that?
Medvedev's so pathetic, like that guy. He says, well, you know what? If Wagner took over Russia, they would have access to the nuclear arsenal. And he used a kind of negative term for Wagner and the West. You really don't want Russia's nuclear arsenal with these crazies, basically. Almost like, oh my God. I mean, it's just like,
A
again,
new level of embarrassing from them, right?
oh, it's just like, every 2 weeks Putin threatens this false kind of threat, like, oh, the West, I've got nuclear weapons too, and nothing ever happens, and no one's at all bothered by it. And now Medvedev's just pathetic comments, it all really points to how out of control things seem to be from the Russian leadership, how they are playing catch up constantly. And it's just adding to the depiction of them as a totally insecure, kind of lost, headless kind of, sorry to bring the chickens back in, but the headless kind of chicken kind of, kind of play. And so this is, it's been commented all over social media and some of the news media. This has all left Putin looking terribly weak, terribly lost, having very little control over anything going forward. Did he have much control up to this point in the last few months anyway, which is interesting.
To that point, Sukant, to your point, okay, here we have comments already coming out of Kiev, as you would have imagined. Of course, the Ukrainians are going to make as much hay out of all of this as they possibly can. So this is kind of a not the best structured headline, mainly because it's a Russian article that's Google translated. But the bottom line is this is Kiev's comments about what Prigozhin said. And I want to read it in its entirety because I think it's instructive here. So this comes from Podolyak, who is one of the main advisors to Zelensky. So for all intents and purposes, this comes directly from the Ukrainian government. Prigozhin's phenomenal choice. You almost nullified Putin, took control of the central authorities, reached Moscow, and suddenly you give up. Because one very specific intermediary with a dubious reputation, Lukashenko, promised security guarantees from the person, Putin, who ordered your destruction this morning. And for the fear that the Putin elite has experienced over the past 24 hours, this order will certainly be carried out, Podolyak wrote on his Twitter. He added that the only benefit from what happened was, quote, Prigozhin humiliated Putin and in his person, the state, and showed that there was no longer a monopoly on violence, close quote. So, bottom line here, I don't really care necessarily the formulations of the Ukrainians. It's all predictable, right? But the point here is that their propaganda point is objective reality, right? They're simply making propaganda out of basic fact. Prigozhin humiliated Putin, humiliated the Russian military forces, humiliated the secretary, the minister of defense, the generals, etc. He humiliated all of them, right?
Yeah, correct. I'm just trying to look at the Ukraine arena here, and I just don't know what Putin's going to do with this going forward. He needs Wagner strategically in Ukraine and other places. You know, it makes sense from the cornered position, and I'm not in any sympathy with Putin at all. But he's in a cornered place here. He's got limited options. Of course, he needed to posture on a negotiated settlement with Prigozhin, ideally, in this whole alarming situation. He was terrified. You know, the best thing he could have done was come out on the streets of Moscow, rally the armed forces, rally his people. But obviously, he's nervous. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't do that in the whole kind of historical period of the military operation, quote unquote. He's just terrified. He's an anxious, terrified human being. And now it's just humiliation upon humiliation. How can things stand going forward? How can he? I mean, it's just become more insecure, more insecure. I haven't heard much from Lavrov as well, which I'm just wondering where he's at. I thought he might come in with a bit of kind of like, you know, bad boy posture or whatever, a bit of a hard man complex that he seems to at times have. So it's all very, very strange. And the Ukrainians always going to take advantage of it on the battlefield, which they already have in Donetsk region. I'm hearing the reports. They're going to continue pressing that. If Wagner is out of Ukraine strategically, it's over for the Russian military operation there. It's just totally over.
And just think for a second what the strategic planners and the various other imperial types in the United States are thinking as they watch all of this. I mean, this is not just a time for celebration. This is like a watershed moment for them, right? They've been looking at potential scenarios to come to this endpoint for quite a long time. And I don't mean in a conspiratorial sense. I mean, it's just basic power struggle politics internationally. And of course, we see that all of this is kind of going over being expressed very carefully in the United States. But there was an interesting thing that I picked up on CNN just a few hours ago that I think is probably worth us discussing a little bit, Sukant. Let's see if I can get it. U.S. officials saw signs Prigozhin was planning this, but they were surprised by the rapid escalation. Now, that in and of itself isn't really a surprise, but what is interesting and what I wanted to get your comment on is that in that article, they mentioned that several days ago, they provided, meaning U.S. intelligence provided a briefing to, some of the select members of Congress who sit on the intelligence committee and so forth, the so-called Gang of Eight, right? Now, the United States knew this was coming several days ago. They even briefed congressional leaders, right? So what does this tell you, if anything, about the situation and about the United States and its perspective on this, Sukant?
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to answer that question off these news headlines, because news headlines is one thing, and what the strategic conversations in the high echelons of the U.S. state is another thing altogether. And I would guess in general they're not going to publicly telegraph all the exact details of what they know and the capacities of various factions. But broadly, I think it's probably true that leading Western military intelligence are taken aback by the depth of the rot in the Russian political class factions. And I think it has taken them aback. I think, like, obviously, if we're going to, in our conversations, going to predict this type of scenario, which we have for a good part of a year, well, of course, people with a lot more resources and leading global colonial capitalist states are going to know even better. But still, I think, Prigozhin is an interesting individual. Prigozhin is like the manifestation of the person that Putin postured as, about a decade ago, as he was going to Syria, the whole bareback horse riding Putin. Like, Prigozhin has kind of taken that persona and has kind of shifted, kind of pushed Putin to the periphery with that. But
I want to ask you about that, because that's an important issue that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention, right? That the years leading up to this, we saw, I would say, dueling, or maybe we should say complementary narratives about who Putin is and what he represents. Because on the one hand, as you say correctly, there was certainly an attempt to posture Putin as the strong man, the man that Prigozhin basically has presented himself as somebody who's willing to take on the West and do all of these things, and was willing to go toe to toe, right, and punch the empire in its nose and all of the rest of it, right? And simultaneously, we also got the narrative of Putin as the crafty chess master, as the man who calculates and plots out every possible scenario and would never dream of making a horrendously boneheaded blunder, right, like this. So what does it tell us that we had both of these ideas of Putin existing simultaneously, both of them proving totally false? And what does it tell us about Putin's image now after all of this?
Listen, if Putin wanted to play the 1980s cowboy film guy Ronald Reagan character in the Russian mirror image of the kind of US global power, I mean, okay, you can try and posture on that. But the point being, and the reason I reference the parallel between Putin's posturing macho strongman leader to Reagan's, is that it's easy to whack Libya. You know, when Reagan bombed Libya in '86 and earlier in the '80s, it's easy to kind of go invade some Latin American country, low-hanging fruit, and all of this kind of type of concept, right? It's easy for Putin to after NATO destroyed Libya, posture like he could have saved Libya and he didn't, but let me go and save Syria. It's easy to go pummel a third world global south country and posture like the strongman. But if you want to, if you want to fight someone, I mean, it's only a tenth of the capacity in Ukraine of the Russian state and the military capacity, but still, it's a bit of a match. It's a bit of a challenge. Ukraine is not Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, with all due respect, and you know where our loyalties lie. It's exactly with these kind of oppressed communities and nations. But then when you enter, so this is what we reference so many times in our conversations, Eric, the dizzy with success. The kind of like believing your own propaganda, which happens to, even low-level drug dealers. You start believing your own hype, and the way people are massaging your ego constantly for their own selfish aims. And that seems to have happened with Putin. Now, that is fine. But when I look at some of my former comrades, 30, 40 years plus in radical anti-imperialist analysis and advocacy and organizing, when we were saying in February, March last year that, look, we don't think this is going to go the way that Russian leadership think it's going to go. We were already raising that question that this could be a terrible failure. It could be just walking into a self-entrapment that the West delivers a quagmire for the Russian state. We were raising all those issues, and that's what's come to pass. And I think it's interesting if we go back to the conversations about 14 months ago. Could Putin have achieved more in hindsight? Could that have been possible? But then that probably would have required a lot more killing of Ukrainians by airstrikes. And then that has on its own knock-on effect that pushes back the Russian strategic approach into Ukraine.
Yeah, carpet bombing its way to Kiev would have been the tactic to achieve that goal. But of course, carpet bombing Ukraine was probably also a way for him to seal his own fate in a different way.
Yeah, and yes, and also there's another comment I'd like to make in this regards. Did Putin really want to do everything he's done ever since the initiation of the Ukraine invasion and occupation and annexation? Did he really want to do it? I get the impression he is just heartbroken that the London, Paris, Washington leadership hasn't brought him into some kind of place on the global table.
Yes.
That's really where he wants to be. And it points to actually probably deep in what he wants to be is part of the Western neoliberal global order. He was most happy dancing, sleazing with women with George Bush Jr., as if you remember back at some conference in Astana or wherever it was. Sorry, I can't remember now.
But he was genuine. Putin was genuine always when he referred to the United States and the West as their partners, right? The partners of the Russians, right? Our Western partners, because that really is how he saw it.
I think he's just heartbroken, and now what? He has to go, skipping off to Tehran. It's just not the same for him, Got to hang out with the flipping Asians, and the Muslims and the flipping Chinese. Like, okay, this is where my life is kind of like, my life aim was to be part of the global Western leadership, and here I am now playing second fiddle to the Chinese. Who's that? Your boys?
Yeah, I got the little one calling me upstairs, and I have to mute myself and go shh. Yeah.
Bring him into the conversation. How you doing?
Well, he's not quite ready for this subject matter.
My boy overheard my conversation with Malik. He's like, "Oh, Papa, you want to go have a conversation with Eric, with Malik?" I'm like,
yeah. Well, that would be great. Maybe we can get Malik in tomorrow. But there's a lot to discuss. But I want to get JD. I want to get JD's comment in here. JD is always excellent. And he asks the very basic and very obvious question: Russian fascists killing Russian fascists in Russia is good for Ukraine, no?
It's good for everyone. It's good for the world, humanity. I mean, yeah, of course, there's innocents always, get caught up in this nonsense. So that's always a sad, scenario, and people don't deserve it. But of course, yeah, when I sent you the proverbial flowers when one of the leading Russian fascists got killed, Daria Dugina, and then the other guy got blown up in that cafe in Saint Petersburg. Good, these people can go to hell, and we have no need for them on the planet. So if they want to do the job against each other, go ahead. And I predict there's probably going to be more of this, and going forward. I mean, it's opened up such like crack. Call it cracks is a gross understatement. I just, I don't know where the hell all of this is going to go, but it's all falling in on itself very quickly. Our first conversations, just an hour before this live, Eric, was you saying, so it's all over, is it? Well, of course it's not. And you're like, well, this is just the beginning of a new chapter of disintegration, etc. Because of course Putin has to show some face, surely. I mean, it's interesting. He hasn't shown face at all for so many months now, And was Kadyrov marching against?
Supposedly, there were rumors that the Chechens were just outside Rostov, just outside the city, that they were just, at any minute they were going to arrive. And of course they didn't arrive. And there's the obvious question of whether they ever intended to arrive. And actually that raises a separate issue that I think is important to note here. Just, we don't have to spend too much time on it, but there is a racialization, there's a racializing element to the way that the quote unquote Chechens, or the Kadyrovtsi, Kadyrov's foot soldiers as they're called, there's a racist component to this, right? That they're seen as sort of the barbarians that do a lot of dirty work.
Turkic hordes.
Yeah, like the Turkic horde that can be sort of mobilized and used against quote unquote real Russians, right? And so the idea of the threat, right, the looming danger of the Kadyrovtsi, right, is the idea that the raping and the pillaging is just around the corner, right? That the horde is ready to be unleashed, and that is also very interesting in the context of Prigozhin, who is extremely and virulently racist, right? And so there is an interesting component here where Putin is almost forced to kind of rely on the non-Russian horde against the more pure Russian Wagner element, right? So there is also this racialized component, which of course connects back to the 1990s, Putin's and the early 2000s, Putin's war on Chechnya, etc. Your comments on that?
Yeah, you've said it all. You've said all that needs to be said in that regards. And of course, we've commented before on the way that Turkic peoples of the Russian Empire within the Federation and in Central Asia have been pushing back constantly on a state level, but also on a grassroots level as well. The incident in telling the white Russian recruiter, I forget now, was it in Chechnya or Ingushetia, I think it was, just telling them just to F off, basically.
Dagestan, that was in Dagestan. But yes, I mean, it happened all over the place. So
yeah, exactly. So we referenced that, and also we've kind of referenced that, the Russian Federation is a white supremacist colonial project, it's a colonial entity. I just actually discussed with a comrade from a native community, the Karelian community, the native in the north that straddles the Finnish into the northern Russian Siberian area. And this comrade was also kind of sharing, because it just reminded me, like, there's so many native peoples that have been colonized who are disgruntled in the Russian Federation. But there was another comment I wanted to make, which I'm trying to catch up with my thread. Yeah, so people who are in support of Putin, be it right or left, or right and left doesn't matter, they're both left and right, whatever, red, brown stuff. So this is interesting. So they were arguing all day that Prigozhin is basically some kind of Western CIA asset now, who's doing the work of Kiev and NATO, etc. But then you have this compromise, right? So now where do they stand? It's just so ridiculous what they come
It changes hour to hour, absolutely.
Yeah, literally. And it's all about just them trying to show their loyalty to Daddy Putin. So so their racket.
Well, you got to get your rubles. You got to get your rubles.
Exactly. That's all that it is. There's just no type of independent thinking. It's such a Stockholm syndrome that they're in. But again, I'm saying that all to say, look, come to these conversations. Come to the conversation that we're having, the work that you're doing from different voices as well. These are the places to go. But also, there's other objective analysts. But bring this all into the framework of the liberation of humanity, of pushing back against all this toxic politics, because we're so deep in this world that sometimes we forget, well, actually we're in this to kind of expose this, to defeat all of this, and to overcome however long and difficult that might be.
To your point, Sukant, and the point that I was also just making, if you look at just the comments from Prigozhin yesterday and early this morning, when he talks about, and actually for weeks on end, when he talks about Shoigu, he calls him the Tuvan degenerate. Right. Of course, the Tuvan people, one of those minorities that you're talking about in the, in the Tuvan, in the region of Tuva. And again, this is the creation of the idea that, like, Shoigu, who, by the way, of course, as you already said, there's no sympathy for these people. These are all war criminals, right? So, but seeing Shoigu as somehow not fully Russian, right? Because he's of Tuvan background. He has that native community blood in him. So he's not sufficiently white. He's not white enough for the true Russian project. Right. And so this, of course, incorporates all of the traditional Russian chauvinist attitude, great Russian chauvinism, which, of course, brings us back to what you opened our conversation this morning with in referring to Lenin and the struggle of the Bolsheviks against precisely this mentality, which then circles us back to Putin's speech of earlier today, where he identified Prigozhin as Lenin, as filling the role that,
yes, he did, about the Civil War or something.
Correct. He referred to Prigozhin in derogatory terms as filling the role that Lenin played, because, of course, we know of Putin's hatred of Lenin and hatred of the Bolsheviks. Right? So it's amazing how Prigozhin sees Shoigu as not Russian, embodies all of the most chauvinist attitudes of true great Russian chauvinism, while Putin then turns reality on its head and acts like Prigozhin is the Lenin, as the bad guy, as the villain. It's all fucking upside down and totally humiliating for Russia, and an embarrassment for anybody who knows anything about this history. But I thought we should bring that up too.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the historic symbolism of what Lenin and Stalin represents to the Russian leadership. It's fascinating. I mean, I wonder how much that this is being kind of swallowed positively by the Russian public, of Putin constantly sniping at the person and the historical political personality and the role that Lenin plays. Does it really wash with the Russian public? Do they listen and say, "Oh yeah, he's got a point there"? Because I mean, maybe they do, because it's posturing hard on the right-wing Russian kind of imperial czarist nationalism, which Lenin's crime was to demolish all of that, and Stalin, to some extent, reconstructs that, especially in the Second World War, with the rehabilitation of the Russian Orthodox Church and all of that kind of political aesthetic histories, etc. This is fascinating to me personally, perhaps to you as well, having been a kind of former quote-unquote tanky, and then kind of kind of critiquing that for the last nearly exactly 20 years. I remember in 03, 04, starting to go back to thinking, well, what's the tensions between Lenin and Stalin here? Kind of breaking out of that kind of that Stalinist dogma, not Leninist, Stalinist dogma. So I think this is all interesting. And again, why raise the figure of Lenin again, if not to try and rally the kind of political, aesthetic, cultural politics of what Alexander Dugin really represents. And he very much exudes that type of Russian and imperial orthodox kind of, mystical past, and constantly wants to reconstitute that as the Russian state today. It's all very, very interesting stuff. But just to finish off, I think people have to be, again, vigilant and understand why Putin is using Lenin to then attack Prigozhin in the way we understand it. I mean, of course, we wish there was an actual, kind of comparable figure to Lenin and a movement that Lenin represented in Russia today, which I don't think there clearly is.
No, but I think that there's another important point here that needs to be discussed at least a little bit, is the fact that referencing Lenin is not really about referencing Lenin's politics. It's not really about even referencing socialism or Marxism or anything like that. Referencing Lenin is basically implying, deliberately implying the notion of a foreign created conspiracy, right? Because the sort of historical role that Lenin plays today in the right-wing Russian chauvinist mind is of the sort of tip of the spear of a foreign conspiracy, one hatched Jewish conspiracy. Well, Jews are foreigners within Russia. That's why Jews were classified as Jews, not Russians. Jews are a foreign nation within Russia or within the Soviet Union, just as any of the other nations.
Oh, interesting. They're all considered that?
Yeah, well, that's why Jews were labeled Jew as their ethnicity within the Soviet Union. You were not a Russian, you were a Jew. You were a Kazakh, you were a Uzbek, you were a whatever, right? Jew is considered on par as a nationality. That's why in the United States, for example, we don't really have the same concept of nationality. We would use use the term more like ethnicity. But in the Soviet Union, there was the term nationality. It was known as, I think it was Article 5 on your passport, on your internal documents, Article 5, which listed your nationality or your ethnicity, right? So anyway, I say this because to bring up the specter of Lenin is to bring up the specter of both the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Great Jew Conspiracy, but simultaneously also just a more generic foreign conspiracy, right? Because as you say, the Red Browners, the Duginists, all of them have been going on all day long about how Prigozhin is clearly part of a CIA, Western, NATO conspiracy, right? Scott Ritter put it right up on his Telegram, on his YouTube channel, on his Telegram.
The child sex abuser.
The child sex abuser, former UN weapons inspector, blah, blah, blah. We know his days from the Iraq. Yeah. Thank you for reminding that. Yes, twice, I believe. Twice convicted, or once had the charges dropped, and then once.
But that was a conspiracy by the Jews as well.
No question, a Jewish conspiracy. They're always Jewish conspiracies. But the point here, like I said, I want to get your comment on this. Raising Lenin raises the question of a foreign hatch conspiracy. That is the purpose of that in the context of today's events.
Yeah, I mean, this is ridiculous politics, isn't it? I mean, I could envisage a scenario where they say that Putin has become victim and he's sold out to the same global conspiracy. I mean, in some ways, we could be at the cusp of that. If Putin does somehow, I don't know, something happens, I don't know what's going to happen with Putin. Sometimes I have these kind of, I don't know what it is. Sometimes I think he just looks so terrified, and he's looked so terrified for so long. He looks so lost and terrified. But going back to the Lenin thing and it's constantly a foreign conspiracy. Prigozhin. I mean, I didn't follow the detail of what the Red Browners and the pro-Russian leadership community thought of Prigozhin until day before yesterday or yesterday. Wasn't he some kind of hero for them? Surely, wasn't he? So what? So they just flipped like that. Okay, I mean, yeah, I've got nothing much more to add to your comments, really, in regards to that. That's just very interesting.
Well, what's interesting too, and this gets forgotten, I think, very quickly, as all things do, that Prigozhin is instrumental in 2016. Okay. And I don't mean because Russia created Trump. That's obviously far too simplistic to even, really entertain that. I think is much more complicated, Russia's role in all of that. But the point is, we know about the Internet Research Agency. We know that Prigozhin funded that Prigozhin operated that. I know that they have multiple propaganda platforms, propaganda outlets, NGOs that they operate. I know you could go through my Facebook and find where I posted their invitations to me directly to come and participate on their panel as the anti-Russia voice that they could then, humiliate or whatever it is they attempted to do, right? And these people reached out directly to me. I know that Prigozhin operates the organization because it's published on the internet. It's all over the place, right? Prigozhin is instrumental in creating many of the platforms, networks, other things that you and I have been talking about for quite a long time now. The Troll Factory was only one part of that, and Prigozhin wasn't the only one. Several oligarchs have been involved in that. As we know, you brought up Dugin already. His benefactor, Malafeyev, is the main funder for a lot of those projects, including Katejon, including those syncretic studies idiots, including Nina Kupriyanova and all of the, the various Nazis and others that have, pretended to be, anti-imperialists or whatever. The money flows directly from these individuals. So when we talk about Prigozhin, we're not only talking about Prigozhin and Wagner. We're not only talking about Russia's presence in Africa. We're also talking about a significant portion of Russia's soft power propaganda apparatus.
Yeah, I got little to add to that. Great stuff. That's all totally correct, and it points to, again, like, I just don't think Putin can afford to break totally with Prigozhin, and if he does, it just collapses his own capacity going forward. And so this deal through it's a bit ridiculous as well. Why is Lukashenko negotiating a deal between Putin and Prigozhin? What level of theater is that? I mean, Prigozhin. Go on.
No, I don't mean to cut you off there, but to your point about theater, we just got this comment from Dima that I think is worth pointing out, because I also had the same thought, and I think it's worth us discussing. Dima writes, in my humble opinion, it was all an outrageous publicity stunt, like the worst Pink Panther movie of all time with a syrupy ending. Putin loves to play the victim hero to legitimize his leadership and drive patriotism. Dima, thank you for that comment. I had the same thought, honestly, but I must admit that I just don't see the benefit for Putin, because it's such a humiliation. It's so embarrassing, unless, of course, and we can't rule it out, unless there's more to come, and this is all like act one of a broader stage play, but I just don't see it right now. I don't see the evidence for that, because I don't see any benefit at all for Putin here. What do you think, Sukant? Did you have the same thought?
Yeah, thank you, Dima Shpakova, for your comment. It's appreciated. Yeah, I mean, of course, he will play the victim hero, and he's constantly kind of developing that industry. I mean, that's the kind of the Russian elite war culture anyway, is we are under the NATO Nazi attack against the Slavic race. There was some Russian leadership today that said that the Slavic race is under threat. Actually, I don't know who said that now. Was it Medvedev or someone? I can't remember.
I missed it. I can't keep track of all the Nazi quotes.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's like you're talking to your point, Eric, in response to Dima. I think, yeah, that's correct. It's way too much of a profound humiliation to play around with. And if you're going to play with that, well, then the consequences are going to come back and kind of slap you in your face. But going back to why is Lukashenko brokering this, I don't really understand that. Perhaps Putin has to use an intermediary, because he can't say, well, look, Prigozhin is my brethren, he's my brother, he's my comrade, like he can't really do that in this context. So maybe he needs to construct that. There needs to be a mediator and some kind of compromise mediation to kind of posture around all of this. But my guess is this, Eric: Putin is not going to disconnect from Wagner going forward. He can't afford to do it. If that happens and the conflict develops between the military industrial complex at its highest echelons on the one hand and Wagner PMC, it's even more fast forward to the end of the Russian project in Ukraine. I just don't see how Putin can make that decision going forward right now. I can't see it.
Yeah, I don't know. And to Dima's point, though, there's a lot of room for speculation here. There's so much that doesn't make sense, and frankly, and not that I'm agreeing with what Dima's saying here, because I do think that this is such a profound humiliation. I can't see that it was orchestrated, but we have seen time and time again these sort of blundering and inexplicable decision making from Putin and Putin's leadership. I mean, the entire invasion itself was just an absolutely world historic blunder on par with some of the worst blunders of modern history. And so on the one hand, I want to say, well, Putin would never do something so stupid, but then he did invade Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think, you know, in our conversations for last 14 months, Eric, you know, I'm sure we've been not quite right on a lot of details, but broadly, it's kind of played out pretty much as we've been analyzing and kind of predicting as well. So I think so. Well done on that. Actually, one of my comrades who was probably in sympathy with the Russian endeavor at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict responded to our earlier chat today, saying, "Well, you basically got it right from day dot." And so, well done for whatever the bloody hell it's worth. This kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. It's another example of not feeling good at all about having been correct.
Oh yeah.
You know, and that goes back to 2015 when we broke ties with RT and the Russian media world over the right-wing racist shit, and everything since then, and everything that has happened since then, including what we described as a global fascist project that has now emerged and is clear to all for all to see. But anyway, going back to Dima's comment about you know, theories, or I guess categorizing Dima's comment as one of the theories about what might have motivated this. I also want to bring up Tavish again. Tavish once more has another important comment that basically the idea that maybe Prigozhin simply did this to threaten Putin and get concessions from him. I would say that that certainly seems to track more with what we see in terms of what's actually happened. But and that was along the lines of my thinking as well. Sukant, what do you think about Tavish's
Yeah, I think that's
point?
part of it. They're all faction fighting for influence and money, and you know, and gold and whatever. I mean, that's just the nature of that's the nature of most actual states. To be honest with you, there's always competing factions for money and influence and power and whatnot. That's definitely a part of it. I don't think it's centrally a part of it. I think Prigozhin has, but obviously he's constantly complaining that he's not getting the war material that he feels that is necessary for his operations in Ukraine, etc., and especially around Bakhmut. That was part of the beginning of this episode of fallout in the last, you know, in the time frame of about last several days to a week, right? But it goes back to him posturing with the Russian dead body, the soldiers of the Russian of the young Russian men who died. Remember all the bloodied bodies? He's screaming in the dark, like, "Look what you're doing to our boys!" Like, crazy, crazy stuff. To be, you know, to be displaying the bodies of dead young men, and then using that to
Disgusting.
kind of, it's just crazy.
If it was done by a person with brown skin, they would talk about the barbarism.
Oh, it'd be Daesh, Islamic
Oh, yeah.
State, Islamophobia all over it, absolutely. But because it's a white Russian, it didn't really get that much comment, even in the Western media, in regards to all of that. Of course, he's up for treasure. He made another important comment today or yesterday, Prigozhin. He said that we had to leave Africa, quote unquote, and he was bemoaning that. I don't know how true that is, to what extent that's true, that Wagner had to redeploy out of Africa. It probably is to a certain extent, because the military challenges and needs are so high in Ukraine. But that's just another little comment that Prigozhin came out with, which is also very racist. We had to leave Africa because of you idiots.
You bastards made us stop our plunder and our pillage and our raping and our mass killings for this?
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. That's exactly what he's saying. So again, I mean, you know, just absolute shame on anyone who's not white and is non-European that's, you know, trying to spin this whole project as anything beneficial to Africans. What? Greetings, Comrade Mustafa.
Oh yes. We and just for the backstory there, Sukant and I had a former comrade who tried to make arguments about how it was so great that the Russians were in Mali conducting counterterrorism operations, including the massacre of hundreds of men, women, and children, because of course Daesh, right? Counterterrorism, right? The glorious war on terror, which we should all be celebrating from the left wing, right?
I just said on Malik Dukier's Twitter live, actually, that we had a Twitter live today discussing Ukraine with some really fantastic other comrades. Thank you, Malik, for that.
And by the way, people follow him at Ministry of Propaganda on Twitter. Excellent, excellent source, good guy, and he'll be on a live here hopefully tomorrow.
Yeah, great. So a comrade sister asked in that chat, like, isn't Daesh the kind of the primary problem where they're deployed in African communities and states? And my response was like, look, Daesh, what is Daesh? Daesh is just a criminal gang with false Islamic garb. That's all that it is. Let's not fall into the Islamophobic trap in thinking criminal gangs that use and abuse Islam is the only problem facing our people. It's not. It's criminal gangs in general, people trafficking, smuggling of goods, etc., racketeering, abduction for ransom, etc. This is happening to all kinds of criminal gangs using whatever type of identity, etc. But I say all of that to push back as well at the whole racist kind of framing of Africa is just a place to kill Muslims, basically. And to loot their mineral wealth. What a crazy world, Eric. Oh, lost you.
Yep. Sorry. I muted myself and forgot to unmute there. Yeah. Sorry. Just to finish up Dima's comment, I wanted to make sure to get Dima's additional reply there. Yeah. I mean, Prigozhin has all of those things. And, I have to admit, the last part of that comment there, Dima, I'm not so convinced that Russia could wipe out Wagner with drones. They've shown to be extremely inept. Russia's air defenses have shown to be extremely inept, being penetrated by Ukrainian homemade drones repeatedly. And it's clear that Russia's military didn't feel confident on the ground. We've seen that in the Ukrainian, in the Ukrainian theater. And we also saw it with Prigozhin's march or alleged march or whatever the hell was happening there. So I'm not sure what Putin really could have done other than, airstrikes, which, if you believe Prigozhin, is what the Russians did. So yeah, I don't know what capabilities they had. And by the way, drones are getting shot out of the sky all the time. Small arms can shoot drones out of the sky. So, I don't know that those drones would have been a permanent answer. But anyway, Dima, thank you for all of the input. That's really appreciated. But anyway, to your point, Sukant, I think that there's a lot of underappreciated aspects to, again, is the question of Russian weakness. Right? Because you mentioned it earlier in the conversation here, U.S. strategic planners were clearly caught off guard by the amount of rot, the weakness of Russia's military. There were very smart people who were predicting the Russian military would overrun Ukraine in a matter of days. They have proven to be inept in every way. What does this tell us moving forward about the future of quote unquote multipolarity, Sukant? Because Russia, in theory, was supposed to be the muscle behind the move towards a multipolar world. That's really the only explanation for why China got involved in this in the first place. China could have presented itself as a neutral arbiter in all of this, but they didn't. They made their bed with the Russians, and I would argue they made their bed with the Russians because they thought they could use the Russians as a battering ram.
All of that. It's just I just have my my hands in my face when I think about what the Chinese political behavior has been. I remember, just a self-critique, I remember the kind of posturing I did some years ago, nearly a decade ago now, like Russia is Russia is the military wing and Chinese is our global economic wing. No, no. I mean, look at the deep crises Ghana has gone through, Sri Lanka has gone through, Lebanon is going through, and other countries. Are China there to bail people out and to give a much healthier counter alternative to economic relations? And no, they're just not. It's just you got to stop this subjectivity, this false understanding and subjectivity about these things. See it for what it is. If it was the case, going back to Dima's comment, if it was the case, for example, that Putin could obliterate Prigozhin and Wagner without serious consequences, he probably may consider it and attempt to do it, but obviously he can't do it. And so look at the way Russia has exposed itself as being utterly pathetic in any kind of military approach, in terms of military analysis, in terms of their whole soft power, social media community. It's all just fallen flat on its face time and time and time again. The Chinese, it'll be so interesting to see the nuances of Chinese leadership behavior now, today and going forward in this regards. Are they really gonna, kind of like pitch their kind of tow rope onto the back of the vehicle, which is the Russian state in this regards? Really?
It's the international relations equivalent of a couple of billionaires going down to see the Titanic.
Oh yeah, which good news,
But I mean, what an ill-fated and poorly thought out mission to go down under the ocean in that way. And similarly, what a poorly thought out posture from China. But it's amusing and also extremely tragic. But I want to point out just very quickly, I was watching earlier today just a little bit, about maybe 30 minutes or so, of Boris Kagarlitsky's live stream on his channel Robkor, which, if you are a Russian speaker, I highly recommend you watch and listen to. There's a lot of really good stuff there. But one of the interesting things that he was pointing out, and this wasn't any kind of deep analysis, but I just thought it was, he was pointing out how hilarious all of this is, how pathetic and just circus-like the whole thing was. And he pointed and he was pointing to several specific examples, but I just want to point out one, and I'm going to play a video here. It's fairly short, but let's discuss what this really is. So that is a clip of a tank that got inadvertently lodged between the two arches in a church building in Rostov, and people were coming and taking selfies with it and laughing about it and chalking it up. Right. This is the civil war. This is the invasion of Russia. What exactly is happening here? It looks like two horribly incompetent, disastrous, blundering military machines, in theory, clashing with each other, right? And Boris and the couple of guests that he had, that they were talking about it, like, that this is a joke. This is one big joke. And that nobody in Russia is looking at this and thinking, well, gee, one of these two really inspires confidence.
West.
It got stuck. It's a fucking tank, and it got stuck in the fucking church.
Hey, bro. Shit happens, man. Leave the guy alone. Poor guy.
I mean, come on.
Listen, Western imperialism can go to hell forever, but I mean, I think Western leaders and the senior intelligence community must be looking at all of this and just laughing their asses off. But it's like, we don't need to do anything. Just look at this mess. But the other thing interesting, so part of the way Macron and the British leadership and Biden, the US leadership, part of the way they've made their excuses to not further arm Kiev to the extent that they have, to not further arm them, is to say, but Putin is a scary man. But Putin has nuclear weapons. We don't want to really provoke him to the extent where he might do something silly. So we can't supply Kiev with more military capacity because he's a scary guy. He can do scary things. Look at it month upon month. It just and you can see increasingly as we go forward, that is just a posture to justify their relative inaction and their instrumentalization of Ukraine as a quagmire, as a mid to long term quagmire for the Russian state. So I think it just kind of really kind of just puts a kind of coaching horses through that whole posture of Western leadership. And also for the West, I mean, NATO theoretically, with their capacity, could probably just remove the head of the Russian leadership collectively, probably quite swiftly and easily. If we take all things into consideration that we know at face value, since the start of the military operation, most recently the buzzing of drones over the Kremlin, and just the inability for the Russian military to deal with that, and the little kind of guerrilla operations targeting certain individuals, and the way that they kind of like there's such low security, the general kind of disaster which has been the military operation in Ukraine, and now with this, I think it just all points to the fact that it's actually a very weak leadership. It's a weak military. It's terrified. It's faction riven. And I don't think it would, God hope it doesn't really, hope it doesn't happen for obvious reasons. But I think NATO could probably go in there quite sharp and fast and do what's necessary. But they're probably deciding not to because it's already going in the direction they want to. And to bring China back into it, this is all really also, not primarily, but at least secondarily, about entrapping Russian into the Russian trap as well. And we referenced that in previous conversations earlier today. And I think China have just walked into that. And I think last point, and just what I want to say here, it's interesting with political conflict, the enemy has to just create a psychological state of increased stress, which achieves so many interesting things. And I think that talks to how the Russian and the Chinese leadership have behaved. They're stressed. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to respond. They're full of growing anxiety and insecurity. And that is resulting in their very foolish strategic false moves that they've been doing. I can't really read it in any other way.
No, I totally agree. And I forgot to shamelessly put that little ticker there at the bottom. Go to my Patreon.
Go to his Patreon, people. Catch the hint. Come on, the brother's trying to tell you something.
But I do have a exclusive content there for subscribers, including one interview that I did, video interview that I did that is not yet available to the public with Ilya Budraitskis, who is one of the great left-wing commentators and political analysts from Russia, historian, author of a very important book about Russian dissidents in the Soviet period. So go over to the Patreon. You could see that and a bunch of other stuff as well. Sukant, I want to back up a little bit and talk about some of the people and ideas that we've been struggling with for many years now. It's been
I got a few minutes here. Go on.
Yeah, it's been 8 years. It's been 8 years since you and I separated permanently from the Russian media world. And in that time, there's been a lot of realizations, including, at least for me, the realization of the global scale, the global sort of scope of what Russia was attempting to do by recruiting people like you and me into their media racket. And many of the people that we used to know, on a personal level, who are still involved in that, don't want to acknowledge the reality of all of this, right? So what have these developments, say the developments of the last 24 hours, but more importantly, the developments of these last 8 years, what do they tell us about that red-brown movement, about the infiltration of the left? I always called it the infiltration because that's what it felt like to me, an infiltration of our circles, of our authentic politics, with this extremely sort of distorted kind of fake anti-imperialist politics. How do you view all of these last days?
It rots your brain. It rots your brain. Just disintegrates your ability. I mean, there's a long-standing Zimbabwean comrade I know. I think he's in the diaspora in the US, but he came out with this tweet today, basically saying, yeah, Prigozhin is funded by the West to destabilize the Russian leadership. And I was like really,
sorry, who is this?
I forget the brother's name now off the top of my head.
Oh, just a random person. Okay.
You know him as well, but I forget his name. Just gone from my head. Someone attached to ZANU PF, someone who's been in our circles for decades. Not George Shirer. He's a bright guy. He's coming up to 80 years old. He's not stupid at all. He's far from it. Respect George if you're listening. And I was just like, and I commented shortly since the inception of the colonial invasion, occupation, annexation of Ukraine by Moscow a year ago as well, that it's attaching yourself to this project means that you've become irrelevant to all the actual issues of our times, because if you're going to attach yourself to that political bandwagon, it holds a reactionary position on every single thing in contemporary world politics and what's facing the grassroots on the planet. Be it racism, be it migration, be it women's liberation, be it the struggle for gay rights, etc., etc. You've attached yourself on a right-wing toxic bandwagon and really you become irrelevant. I mean, I often think about my comrades, ex-comrades, who've gone into kind of being loyal to Putin in this particular timeline. It's like, how can you, and most of them happen to be white. There's an interesting role of whiteness, not always, because of course anyone can internalize this trashy politics, but there is a pattern here by which former white comrades of mine relating to me as a non-white person, as a racialized immigrant from the global south to the colonial center from a former British colony, that they want to tell me that they defend my right to be here safely while attaching themselves with the far right global community. How can these two things make sense? How can you be my friend and their friend at the same time? You know, we can go back to playground politics. How can you be friend of the bully who's bullying all the little kids and be a friend of the little kids as well? It's a ridiculous state of affairs, and it's a humiliation. It's patronizing me and my community of racialized communities, and it's a humiliating thing on a political kind of emotional level. So I mean,
and it's done in the name of a lesser evil, right? That we don't
that's
like.
even worse.
We don't like we don't like what the Russians are doing. We don't like what their white supremacist politics. We don't like their racism. We don't like their homophobia. We don't like all of these things and their, you know, traditional blah blah blah, all of this. But we have to kind of not really talk about all of those things
Yeah,
because
exactly.
the United States and the British are the bad guys. And, you know, if you talk about these bad things that the Russians are doing, you actually work for NATO and the CIA. So shut the fuck up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, whatever. Whatever. I mean, if these people are serious, really kind of put out. I've actually noticed as well that entire camp, if they've narrowed even what they contribute on. It's become so narrow. It's just boiled down to spinning the Islamic Republic of Iran as positively as you can, China as positively as you can, and Russia as positively as you can. That's it. That's the entire political work now. That's the entire political culture. There's nothing interesting to say about anything else on the planet, in our communities at all. But good, just go with that rubbish. You know, if that's where you want to be, just, it's good. It's like we referenced before. It's a kind of a purging to get these people out.
Well, and they also not only getting the people themselves out, but it's getting the ideological framework out, right? Those who claim to be left wing but use the war on terror framework to give an analysis of Syria, right? Which is absolutely something that I was guilty of in the first years of my participation in the Russian bullshit world, and I think that is something even much more important than the individuals. It's that kind of thinking that has to be purged out of our circles, because that is not left wing. That is not anti-imperialism. That is not anti-colonialism. That is actually sort of an internalization of neocon thinking and a neocon framework, right? So I agree. I think it's a good thing. Now, Sukant, are we out of time? You have another few minutes?
Go on.
All right. I'm going to get some comments here because I'm so wonderful at doing all of this technology stuff that I prepared an entire series of images for a live stream like 3 weeks ago that I never got around to doing. So we're going to run through those images right now. This is like the bonus round in a game show. Yeah. Okay. This is the lightning round for you, Sukant. Okay. We're going to start here. Lightning round, nature of sanctions. This was an article that I came across from Kedar Media, which is a very interesting environmentally focused outlet in Russia, or was in Russia, probably now operating in exile. But the bottom line is, this is talking about how the sanctions and, well, how Russia's war and the sanctions have created basically what I would call a war on nature in Russia. Right. Of course, Russia is not the leading polluter on the planet. That would be the United States, the Chinese, the U.S. military, the Pentagon, et cetera. These are, of course, the leading polluters. But Russia is picking up the pace with its environmental degradation. And so one of the things that's happened is, as a result of the sanctions, it's forced Russia out of the global market in a lot of areas. And it's forced them to do things like strip mining former nature preserves, removing all of the legal protections for many of the national parks and other areas all throughout Siberia, which is, of course, part of the climate change question, right? The melting permafrost, the accelerated warming in the Arctic regions, the Siberia being, of course, one of those. This is all happening. And then in addition to that, and I want to get your comments on this, as part of all of that, the Russians have accelerated mining for gold, accelerated mining for rare earth minerals. I'm talking accelerating in the Arctic, okay? Because of course, the melting Arctic region creates tremendous opportunities for a rapacious capitalist state like Russia. And so what are they doing now? We now have a proposal to mine silver and copper in the Arctic using nuclear power. They're going to build nuclear facilities in a warmed Arctic environment in order to insulate themselves from the sanctions. So part of the Western economic war on Russia as a result of Russia's literal war in Ukraine, that economic war is now driving Russia in an increasingly dangerous direction environmentally. What happens when the, corrupt and hemorrhaging Russian state starts moving forward with building nuclear projects in the Arctic? I can only think of the most catastrophic scenario.
Yeah, good research, by the way. That's really interesting. We've been seeing crazy temperatures in the Arctic Circle. There's already a great game going on between leading states in competition in spheres of influence up there. Also, let's not forget the native communities who also reside in these areas, who are being pushed aside, who are being made ill by environmental degradation as well, and all of that. I mean, the Russian leadership don't care about any of this stuff. I mean, it's just disaster upon disaster when it comes to environmental policies as well. I mean, I've got nothing to add. It's just really interesting research.
Well, to that point, just to build on that, we also had this one, which is a very important question having to do with water. Okay, and this is, of course, as we know, not restricted, not relegated to Russia. We had all throughout last summer, we saw rivers running dry all over Europe, in France, in Germany, in Italy, elsewhere. We have the same thing in the United States. We saw the similar things in China, in Asia, right? But think about this. Russia is a highly nuclear country. Nuclear technology requires vast amounts of fresh water to keep the cooling systems operating, to keep those things functional. So what happens as the rivers in Russia run dry? Because it's not just about drinking water, right? So we have, for instance, this quote, last year, one of the longest rivers in the world lost almost half of its natural water level, right? And this goes on and on. There was so little water left in it, it became impossible to eliminate the consequences of accidents in oil and gas production sites in the Caspian Sea. Okay, we're again talking about massive, massive environmental damage. Low water in the Don, okay, one of the most important bodies of water in Eurasia. Basically, same for the Volga, same for all of these key rivers, right? The trouble is with all the rivers that flow in the steppe and the forest steppe in the Southern Federal District. The Volga was in a critical situation. Its shallowing is observed in many regions of Russia. And if 10 years ago they talked about the need to save the river, today environmentalists say it is impossible to stop the process of destruction of its water resources. Last quote I'm going to give here because I think it's important. We talk about the role that Russia has played in Eurasia, in climate change, in all of this. Look at what's happened with Russia's water supply. Russia can't export all of its critical exports if it doesn't have water. How is it going to move that cargo, much of which goes along these rivers, right? The Chinese are looking at cheap exports coming out of Russia. How are they going to stay cheap if they can't move them? You know what I'm saying? So the water issue is an environmental issue, and it's also a very serious economic issue. I know I'm kind of throwing this out at you without you having done research ahead of time, Sukant, but I just figured we should at least talk about the fact that the war is not relegated to these political questions. There's deep economic questions and environmental questions that are being settled in this disastrous campaign.
Yeah, good research. Thanks again. I think also just bringing the Chinese project going forward as well, because that's sucking up a lot of resources, as the Chinese people, who have every right to become relatively more affluent. I mean, that I have to say that's a right of a former colonized people, but nevertheless, they're doing that in a capitalist framework globally, which means that it's gonna, we all got a bit of the, the blood and tears of Congolese children and these bloody gadgets and what we're speaking, the means by which we're speaking across as well. But China is joining into that looting and extraction across the world, particularly in Africa, and also in relation to the kind of the information and the research that you've shared. So again, we have to go back, and you've kind of been studying your frameworks of degrowth socialism, and how some of Marx's Marxist theory from Marx himself informs that as well. And I think that's important for people to really grapple with this. I don't know if you've done a video on that, but I encourage you to do that, because it's important. Part of the contribution and part of the political conversation we need to be developing is understanding and critiquing the just unsustainable, well, because these bloody red brown grifters, there's all these new books and all these stupid articles just red washing and greenwashing China actually as well. But also, you have to look at China as a global state, which it is a global state, and it's deployed globally as well. So we have to have a more accurate and critical socialist understanding of what a more sustainable world economic relationship looks like, and how people can. Fundamentally, I think it has to. It's about countering whiteness as it manifests in the kind of the normalized, what Aaron Bastani would quote as in his internalization of this problematic politics of the full luxury communism,
fully automated luxury communism,
so
blah blah blah.
So that's the internalization of the kind of the most conceited kind of global white colonial settler type of politics, and trying to force a socialism into that, but it remains an unsustainable kind of rapacious kind of relationship to the vast majority of the workers and peasants and their land and their environment. What I'm saying is we have to actually construct a counter vision to what's normalized in terms of shopping malls, concrete, steel, glass, that bling that you see in the finance capitals of, pardon the pun, in Beijing and Shanghai. That's not socialism. That's not red Chinese communism. That's just capitalism, and it's an aping of Western capitalism, actually. But anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely correct. And I think it's important to bring up these environmental questions because they are really central for everybody. And it's easy to ignore what's going on in Russia vis-a-vis environmentalism because it's kind of seen as, I don't know, only tangentially related, but in fact, it's a central issue here. And I just want to say in the last couple of minutes that we have, I know I have a couple of other stories that I wanted us to talk about. And this is, of course, I actually grabbed this like 3 weeks ago. So the fact that we're talking about this whole Prigozhin drama is very interesting because here was this story: Stream and Torch, the Gazprom-backed militias fighting in Ukraine. So Wagner is not the only private mercenary organization that's operating in Ukraine. In fact, there's 2 of these that are backed directly by Gazprom. Okay, so again, this goes back to that issue that I already brought up about Putin's, I would say, support, but also cautious skepticism of Prigozhin and of Wagner, and of his need to kind of diversify Russia's mercenary outfits. So now you have these mercenary outfits, which, by the way, they're recruiting directly out of Gazprom's workforce. Gazprom employs tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. I'm not even sure how many, but it's a massive, massive enterprise. By the way, many of its employees in its security sector are former Russian military. So again, they're recruiting former Russian military for the purposes of filling out these militias. And it might just be that Stream, Torch, and God knows whichever other militias may very well take over the brand that we used to call Wagner.
Eric, listen, if the Russian leadership want to, diversify and to increase their factions of PMCs, where do you think that's all going to lead to? Good luck with that. good luck with that, Putin. That's just ridiculous. It's just so interesting, isn't it? That he doesn't seem to even want to attempt to tighten up his own Russian military. It's like, what's going on there? He's just kind of, it seems like there's no notion of trying to fix that. But you're going to go with more factions of, PMCs in your field of military operation? It's just mad, That's how I see it. That's my first response. It's like, oh, more factions,
Well, and to your point,
competing with Prigozhin.
To your point, Sukant, about how is it that he sits here and has this military machine that looks like some kind of a joke, right? And it's just like, it's hard to believe. And yet every day there's stories like this one. Russia has to buy back its own military hardware that it exported to Asia. Let's not forget, Russia's number 2 export after oil has traditionally been weapons. It's always been that the Russians are second in the world behind the United States in terms of arms dealing. Okay,
this whole culture of self-humiliation. Can you imagine leadership in Delhi and in Myanmar, like, oh, the Russians want their stuff back, they sold to us, like, huh? Like, listen, I'm Indian, I can do the accent, right? No one else can do it.
Yeah.
It's like, what? I mean, what do you think people are saying and thinking about this? Anyway.
Very, very interesting as well. And when you come across stories like this one, where we know that, hey, they can't even really ship all of their exports, right? Because the Russians, that's why the Russians are having to sit around trying to make deals with the Iranians so that the Iranian tankers can carry Russian oil, because the Russians don't have their own tankers and they've always depended on other countries to do it for them because, hey, they're a capitalist country. And now they're shut out of the global capitalist system, so they're screwed.
Well, understand, why in these contexts that, the Russian political class has to construct such a out of sync with reality nationalist war culture.
Exactly right. That's what it is. Out of sync with reality, 100%.
Yeah. I gotta go because boys are knocking on the door.
Yep. Nope. That's okay. Listeners, viewers, I don't know why I said listeners. You're all viewing this, of course. Thank you for the support. Let me do that. Oh, let me do that obnoxious thing that crawls on the bottom of the screen there. Go to patreon.com/Eric Draitser.
Listen, if that kind of putting his ticker tape back on doesn't get some Patreon followers, right? I'm coming for you guys, all right?
Don't make me start threatening to, do things like I don't know, take my shirt off. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I couldn't think of anything. All right. Thank you for the support. Of course, the Patreon, follow Malcolm X Movement on Twitter. MX Movement is the handle there. And maybe we'll do
narrative news as well. Go and give that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Counter Narrative News as well on YouTube. Follow them on Twitter. And let's do this again tomorrow, Sukant. I'm sure there will be tremendous developments between now and then.
Absolutely. There was in the last 6 hours.
I know. Exactly. Talk to you all again very soon.